War had broken out between Israel and Philistia. Jonathan, the son of the king of Israel Saul, had attacked and destroyed a Philistine garrison at Geba. The news about the defeat spread quickly throughout the Philistines, and they mobilized their army. They managed to muster an army of 30,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and a vast number of infantry. They were camped at Michmash, east of Beth-aven. When the men of Israel saw the vast size of the army, they began to melt away. Some even crossed the Jordan River and escaped into the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul, and what remained of his army, was stationed at Gilgal. Samuel the prophet had instructed him to wait for him there, so they could make a burnt offering to the Lord. King Saul waited for 7 days, but Samuel still didn't come. King Saul knew his men were deserting him, so he said, "Bring me the burnt offerings and the peace offerings." And he sacrificed the burnt offering himself, without Samuel. But just as he was finishing, Samuel arrived. Saul went out to greet him, but was rebuked by Samuel. Saul tried to excuse himself, telling Samuel he did it to improve the morale of his men. Samuel rebuked him further, telling him that God would end Saul's kingdom, and had sought out a man after God's own heart to rule in his place. Samuel then left Gilgal and went on his way. Saul and his troops marched from Gilgal to Gilbeh. When Saul counted the men he had with him, he discovered he only had 600 men left. There were no blacksmiths in the land of Israel at this time, because the Philistines wouldn't allow it, out of fear they would make swords and spears. So, whenever the Israelites had to sharpen their farming tools, they had to go to a Philistine blacksmith. None of the men of Israel had swords or spears except Saul and Jonathan. One day, Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Come on, let's go over to where the Philistines have their outpost." But Jonathan didn't tell his father what he was doing. Meanwhile, Saul and his 600 men camped at the outskirts of Gibeah, around the pomegranate tree at Migron. None of them realized that Jonathan had left the camp. To get to the outpost, Jonathan had to cross between two rocky cliffs that were called Bozez and Sineh. Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Let's go across to the outpost of those pagans. Perhaps the Lord will help us, for nothing can hinder the Lord. He will win a battle, whether he has many warriors or only a few." Jonathan's armor-bearer gave his support for whatever Jonathan did. Jonathan told his armor-bearer that if the Philistines yelled down at them, "Stay where you are or we'll kill you," then they would stay. But if they yelled, "Come up and fight," then they would go to fight, because that would be the Lord's sign of victory. When the Philistines saw them coming, they yelled, "Look! The Hebrews are crawling out of their holes." Then they yelled to Jonathan, "Come up here and we'll teach you a lesson." Jonathan and his armor-bearer, knowing it was the sign from God, both climbed up. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer killed those who tried to attack him from behind. In that single ambush, they had killed 20 Philistines. Panic broke out in the Philistine army, and then an earthquake hit. The Israelite lookouts saw the massive Philistine army break and flee in all directions. Saul ordered a roll be called, and they discovered Jonathan and his armor-bearer were missing. After attempting to consult the priest, Saul and his army rushed out to battle and found the Philistines killing each other. The Hebrews hiding and the ones in the Philistine army revolted and attacked the Philistines. The men of Israel gave chase to the Philistines, but they had to give up the chase because Saul had made a rash oath that no one would eat until the Philistines were destroyed. The men of Israel were too hungry and exhausted to continue. Even so, with this rash oath, God gave Israel an amazing victory. The Israelite army defeated a vastly superior Philistine army because King Saul's son, Jonathan, and his armor-bearer trusted in God and took the Philistines by surprise. During World War I, 3,000 years later, the same tactics in the same place were repeated with the same result. In 1918, during World War I, General Allenby of the British Army and his troops were in what is now the nation of Israel. General Allenby's men were buying Bibles to use to learn the geography of the region. They were tasked with taking Michmash from Ottoman troops stationed there. One of the British majors Vivian Gilbert, reading the Bible passage, realized that the Michmash in the Bible was the same as the Michmash where the Ottomans were camped. He further realized that the Ottomans were in the exact same position the Philistines had been in. He then woke the brigadier, who read the story again. The general then decided to send out scouts, and discovered that the pass Jonathan and his armor-bearer had gone through on the way to attack the Philistines were only lightly guarded by the Ottomans. The general then changed the battle strategy, and instead of sending all of his troops to attack, he sent only one infantry company during the night. They silently dispatched a few of the Ottoman troops and passed between Bozez and Sineh, which are rocky crags that Jonathan and his armor-bearer had passed through. They climbed the hillside and onto the flat piece of ground the Ottomans and Philistines had camped on. The sleeping Ottomans woke up, thought they were surrounded by the entire British army, and fled. The British killed or captured all of the Ottomans at Michmash. Through reading the Bible and trusting in its word, the British had captured Michmash from the Ottomans.